So welcome to our second session on the prophetic imagination. How are we doing on books? Has everybody been able to acquire one of the editions of the books? It's in a third edition now. Looks like Denny's got it. He's ready to roll. Ready to go. Last time when we met, we just had a little introduction to Walter Brueggemann. I think it's interesting to note that he was born in Nebraska. And you know what other great religious figure was born in Nebraska? Does anybody know? L. Ron Hubbard. So,
No, I knew I mentioned that before.
yeah,
And
I
but
know.
don't leave out Richie Ashburn. The
I'm
third,
sorry.
don't leave out Richie Ashburn, the third famous guy from Tilden, who's a Hall of Fame baseball player.
Oh, Richie. Okay, I was going to say, boy, I thought I knew my theologians, but
No.
so was Hubbard also born in Tilden?
Yes, all
Oh
three of
my
those guys
gosh.
were.
I thought
And
they
then
were,
if
but
you, and then if you go to Wahoo, you can find like a Nobel winner, a Pulitzer winner, and something else.
well, you can't beat that for a town, with the name Wahoo.
No, and a Hall of
So
Fame baseball player.
yeah. Well, good. Yeah, so let's forget about L. Ron Hubbard for now and let's focus on Walter Brueggemann. But in the preface of his the second edition of his book, he kind of tipped his hat to some of the people that he uh, felt that he owed a debt of gratitude to, or at least an acknowledgement that he's on the same page with them, in terms of his methodology. One of those was Norm Gottwald, who, introduced a more social scientific method into the study of the Old Testament, especially the period that we're looking at around, or will be looking at around the time of the Exodus and the time of the Judges. And as well as the rhetorical criticism of Phyllis Tribble. This is especially important because Tribble is the one who introduces the idea that there are rhetorical aspects of the Hebrew Bible, especially, that introduce a new imaginative way to understand the world. And of course, Brueggemann is going to draw upon that critically when he talks about the prophets, because that's what the prophets are going to do, is they're going to reach into tradition and to try to offer an alternative reality that speaks to the hearts and to the commitments of the people. And then we talked about liberation theology, which was, very, very important at the time that Brueggemann was writing. This idea that yeah, when we read the whole of Scripture and the narrative itself from the beginning all the way to the end, we see a preferential option for the poor. And this type of theology was very, very important in the development of a lot of the what we might call postmodern theologians, whether it's the feminist theology or Mujerista theology or Black theology. All of these liberation theologies are going to be written from the perspective of the social context and experience of these sub communities. Uh, I use the term sub communities because Brueggemann uses it, and I'll be referring to that. Um, but in all of this as well, and I want to mention this because at least at First Presbyterian Church, and we're doing the narrative lectionary this week, this Sunday, we're going to be reading the narrative of King Solomon and the establishment of the temple. Uh, and to Brueggemann's way of thinking, and to the way of thinking of many people who, kind of fall upon the prophetic tradition, this was a um, tragic turning point in the history of Israel because, look at the history that we're talking about. You get a group of people whose experience of God's liberating freedom from Egypt draws them into the desert. They create for themselves a new constitution, you might say, under the Ten Commandments, and their understanding of their obligations to God and to themselves. They come into the land and they live as a confederated group of tribes. Uh, no kings. Dare I mention that in this particular contemporary context, no kings. We don't want a king, right? Because we know what kings were like in the earlier period. We were running away from kings. Our whole alternative community is a response to the need to live without this kind of oppressive structure of, of, of a kingdom, right? But eventually, what happens is that, for reasons that we'll get into, a king has to be chosen, and we talked about that. Actually, we saw Damon was preaching on that last Sunday, the day after the No Kings protest, right? And we get this First Samuel passage where Samuel is going to God and says, "Hey, the people want a king," and Samuel tries to tell the Israelites, "Look, here's what kings are going to do. They're going to take your men, they'll put them in the army. They're going to take a major portion of your produce of your land. They'll take your daughters. All of these things. Why do you want a king?" But eventually, the people do get a king. First it's Saul, and then it is David, and then it's under David that Israel becomes this confederated nation that we can actually call a kingdom. And then under David's son Solomon, a temple is established, a temple on the hill. Now remember what had happened prior to that time. And I know this seems like a lot of review, but it's really essential to put your mindset in this time period for reading Brueggemann. Prior to this time, they had this thing, the priests would go to the various they would go to the various tribes and their various geographical locations and take with them the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was that that vessel that carried the Ten Commandments, and it was understood that this was the presence of God. And so when worship would happen before the presence of God, the people felt that God was coming to be with them, right? Now, with the establishment of the temple, you have a God literally in a box. God does not move from this place. So Jerusalem itself, and specifically the kingdom of David and the king, come to be associated with God almost as if the two go hand in hand, right? God no longer goes out among the people, but the people have to come to God. And there are mediators between the people and God. The priests, and of course, the king is seen as God's chosen son. This is where we get the whole language in Psalm 2. Today I have begotten you. Today you are my son, right? So it's understood that the king is seen as the son of God, creating this separation between the people and God. This is what is going to be that Brueggemann is going to refer to as the royal consciousness, also referred to variously as the monarchical theology. Now, the reason I say this is because when Brueggemann wrote this book, this challenge of the monarchical theology or the royal consciousness, he actually referred to it as a false consciousness, a consciousness that was contrary to the original intent of God's act of freedom in creating this alternative community, right? But there were many people when Brueggemann wrote this who were very, very upset with him because this monarchical theology establishes this whole kind of kingdom idea that David is the king and David's son, and that Jesus himself was going to, fall in this line of kingship. So there's a strong monarchical element to the understanding of Jesus as Messiah, as descended from David. The trouble with that is that it relies upon this idea that has Israel at its or Jerusalem at the center, the temple, King David, all of those things that are demonstrated throughout the history of the Hebrew prophets to be oppressive and unjust. So when we refer to Jesus as the Messiah and who is ushering in the kingdom of God, the last thing we want to do, says Brueggemann, is to think that all of a sudden the monarchy of David has been renewed. Now, hopefully you can, as I say this, you can draw the connection between what is happening in Israel today and this idea of a kind of monarchical theology. The idea that as goes Israel, so goes the kingdom of God, or as goes Christian nationalism, so goes the kingdom of God. This is what the prophets want to fight against, the static understanding that God is on the side of those in power, that those who are in power can be oppressive and unjust because they are working on the side of God. This was precisely the problem with Solomon, right? He started taxing everybody, started conscripting people into the army, and before you knew it, you had no alternative community. You just had a king who was no different than any of the other kings. So the royal consciousness refers to that unimaginative, static, oppressive, unjust political structure that tries to affirm that God is on the side of those in power. And you can imagine that this is precisely what people like Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Heschel, and others in the 60s and 70s were trying to provide an alternative to. So any questions about that? Please think about this when we read this text on Sunday, because some people are going to look at this as a glorious text. This is God establishing God's kingdom. The temple is the only place where God can be encountered. That's quite different from how God was encountered during the 12 tribes when the Ark of the Covenant would go to the people. Any comments or questions? I feel like I'm talking very fast here, and I don't want to do that. Well, you can probably tell we're right in the thick of this in our current political situation. As you're reading the prophetic imagination, you're going to see touch points with Christian nationalism. You're going to see touch points with, the idea of the United States as a Christian nation, the city on the hill, that really has all the potential to be very oppressive in and of itself. Last time when we were together, let me see if I can move ahead here. Darn it, went too far. I just want to mention this reference that Brueggemann makes in the preface to Flannery O'Connor, because as he was writing, he was writing in 1978, a lot of people were trying to interpret, what it was that Flannery O'Connor was doing in her literature, in her short stories and in her novels. Flannery O'Connor is a very difficult person to understand, but I find I've never been able to really get what she's doing. But apparently, there is this sense that O'Connor, she was a very devout Catholic, and with Catholicism comes a kind of sacramentalism. In other words, it's not just about the sacraments of the body and the blood, the host and the wine, but it's the idea that God can be encountered in the world, that God is present throughout the world, right? But what happens is we kind of develop a film over our eyes, our spiritual eyes, that prevents us from seeing that God. We might call them cataracts. Yeah, we can't see deeply enough into the world and encounter God there. And what that takes then is an act of pure imagination. I mean, diving down deep into your own soul and thinking of the world in a completely alternative way. And this is what O'Connor was able to do. If you know her work, A Good Man is Hard to Find. And her protagonists end up being crazy people For example, in Wise Blood, the guy by the name of Hazel Motes, I love that name, Hazel Motes. He was starting the Church of Jesus Christ without Jesus Christ. Um, and you can kind of see the prophetic aspect of that. He would walk around with shards of glass in his shoes just to remind him of what a sinner he was. But it's in this kind of craziness that you encounter an understanding of what God is doing in the world. To that end, I just want to read what O'Connor was talking about in um, on page 14 and 15. Let me find that here. Okay. The imagination, O'Connor discovered, might accomplish much more. It might become the channel of visionary awareness. For O'Connor, as for Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, it is the imagination with its roots deep in the human unconscious that is the link between the depths of the self and the unseen reaches of the universe that can reveal to finite man his apocalyptic destiny. That is precisely what the prophets are going to do. And this is what the prophetic imagination is all about. So let me just read that again because it's really a central statement here. For O'Connor, and I would say for the prophets, as for Aquinas, it's the imagination with its roots deep in the human unconscious. That's the link between the depths of the self and the unseen reaches of the universe that can reveal to finite men and women their apocalyptic destiny. So it's the presence of God that let's say, to refer what we were just talking about, to imagine that God is something more than a God who is confined to a temple on a hill or to a particular religious ideology. But God can be met once again as God originally was met in the depths of the human soul. And oftentimes that involves suffering. It is in our suffering that we come into touch with the God whose essence, whose presence pervades the entire universe. And this is what the prophets were able to do. And you can let me stop there and see if there are any uh, questions or comments.
Your mic's not on.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a short story called "A Good Man is Hard to Find" that
Right.
um, kind of demonstrates what you're talking about. There's this woman who's, all full of herself and thinks she's better than other people. And she's going along on a vacation with her family, and they run into this escaped murderer and his pals. And she keeps trying to appeal to his sense of coming from good people, and then I know you
Yeah.
come from good people. And then when he's got his gun out, he's about to shoot her, and she has this like little divine revelation,
Mhm.
reaches out to him and says, "You're my son, you're my child." And she tries to touch him, and he shoots her. But she's come to this vision, she's come to clarity right before she dies.
Wow. Yeah, and that's why I don't understand O'Connor at all. Just because I want stories to resolve, but the resolution there isn't one that's a rational resolution, right? You want, or I would want, after she says that, she has that epiphany, she wants it to be, you know, she wants him to have the same epiphany as well, or you would think. Um,
Except he's so bright, he says she would have been a good woman if there'd been somebody to shoot her all the time.
Well, I'm so glad you're with us because I remember the story and it's so haunting. And there all of O'Connor's are stories are like that. But yeah, they do not resolve themselves in those happy ways.
Oh,
Yet there is
no.
always, in some way, some sort of epiphany, some sort of insight that takes somebody from their individual uh, perspective into the world and universalizes it.
Right.
The sadness in it lies in the fact that sometimes that universal vision is not appreciated by others, I guess. So thank you, Constance. I'm so glad you're here because you probably taught this
Gazillion times.
a
Yeah.
gazillion times. Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of where the prophets come from, it's probably no um, surprise that you don't find many prophets, or no, at least none that are recognizable in the halls of the corner offices of Wall Street, nor in the the mega churches in downtown Dallas, but they typically are coming from alternative, what we might call alternative communities. In fact, uh, uh, Brueggemann does not really call them alternative, he calls them sub communities. And these sub communities are usually marked by four basic experiences. And one of these is a long and available memory. So actually, as I'm saying this, try to think, for example, of the African American church and the African American experience, you know, from the time of the antebellum South all the way to to the present, right? There is a long and available memory, stories that are told in the community itself that are sometimes, let's say, um, alternative ways of reading a more general narrative. Uh, and there's a sense of pain. There is suffering that has taken place. Yet in the midst of that suffering, there is an active practice of hope. And that hope is communicated through an effective mode of discourse. I cannot help but think of uh, the work of Zora Neale Hurston or the work of oh gosh, I can't remember the name. The Cotton Patch Gospel, if you ever have read that story. But in the African American community, slaves were converted by their masters to Christianity in the hopes that the slaves would hear Paul's words that slaves have to be obedient to their masters. Up until that time, they were not allowed to read or to have the Bible till somebody finally said, "Hey, look, if we can turn them into nice, obedient, little slaves, it says very clearly in Paul in several places that slaves have to be obedient to their masters." Well, what happened in that is that a story was introduced to them that had deep, deep roots in their experience. And it's the story of Moses and, speaking out against Pharaoh, of people who are sorely oppressed, who have their own experience of liberation, even in the midst of these oppressive structures, right? So the African American experience in the United States, especially, well, I mean, exclusively, I guess, if they're African American, is one in which the potential for prophetic discourse is very great because all of these things are present. A long and available memory founded in the story of liberation and justice seen in the Exodus story. There's a sense of pain, this group of people being oppressed by a dominant culture, but an active practice of hope. I don't know about you, but I remember when I was growing up, the African American people that I knew, there were an incredible number of people named Moses. Moses was a name that I heard. I mean, my parents would never imagine, you know, uh, never even think to name me Moses. But in the African American community, Moses is a name of great hope, right? And so you see these little touch points all along the way. And then the mode of discourse, African American preaching, my goodness, this is what turned Dietrich Bonhoeffer in away from being just a stuffy German theologian into a person who was on fire for the gospel. He came to New York City, worshipped in one of the, I think it's Alabaster Baptist Church. It was in Harlem, and he saw this vibrant community that was on fire with, these very things. And he brought that idea back to Germany, and it was partially as a result of this that, the whole resistance movement to Hitler was able to be, established along theological lines. I also think that, we just got finished reading Zora Neale Hurston 2 stories back. I think this is one of the reasons that Zora Neale Hurston, in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance movement, the late 20s and 1930s in Harlem, you had all of these authors who are trying to demonstrate, their intellectual prowess, right? That they could write with the best of them, white or, or whatever. And Hurston said, you guys are trying to write like you're from Harvard. That's not who we are. And I want to write stories, Hurston said, that retains the tenor, the tone, and the cadence of the African American experience, because that is the language of hope. That's the language of our community. Why do you guys want to capitulate to the dominant culture? And so really, somebody like Brueggemann would say, look, Hurston wanted to maintain that prophetic attitude, and thus she continues to write with her characters speaking, a very Southern African American dialect, where many of her colleagues were trying to get rid of that. I think Brueggemann would say they're capitulating to the dominant culture. So, um, any thoughts about Hurston? We read kind of an odd book of hers on King Herod. If you read, for example, her eyes were watching God, their eyes were watching God, you will see this, this kind of dialect that comes through all the time. So,
Dan,
comments? Yeah,
her short story that was published, I think, 100 years ago in 1925, has just been recovered, and this was turned into a play by her in the 30s, and
that's
it's
right.
just been performed by the Yale University Repertoire Theater. And there's a piece, I can send it to you, that was in the New York Times the other day about it. I thought, and it just hit me, woo.
Yeah,
It takes a while for an African American author, as we found out from reading her background, to be finally recognized years and years after she has passed.
right. Yeah. And actually, Denny, you sent me that article, and
I thought maybe I did.
the reason I put this reference to Zora Neale Hurston in here is because I wanted to send that article to everyone, afterwards. So, I mean, if you want to send it, uh, because it's exactly what we're talking about, right? It's a story about the African American experience. I think it takes place in Florida, where she's from, or at least in the Deep South. And uh, all of those prophetic elements that we're talking about, this long and available memory, the sense of pain, practice of hope, and an effective mode of discourse are all taking place, from what I could tell. And there's a little video too about the play as it was being produced as well. So
Dan, do you have
yeah,
access to the email addresses for all
Yeah.
of us, better than if you would send that on, it'd be a much quicker,
Yeah.
I mean, to get it
Yeah.
to everybody.
I will try. Yes, I will try to do that. And I can't remember. See, I have two email addresses, and sometimes I get it at CCC, and sometimes I get it at Gmail. I'm trying to get everybody to send me things at Gmail, so I will look for that. And it was in the New York Times. I think the article appeared in the New York Times. Did it not, Denny? Yeah. So, okay. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, let's having said this, that that prophets come from a sub-community who experience this memory of pain and this experience of hope. uh, Brueggemann wants to ask this question, and he was asking the question, of course, in 1978 as he was writing: is it possible these days for the church to be such a sub-community? We have in so many ways capitulated to the dominant culture of consumerism. And this was when he was writing, and think of how utterly consumeristic we are now. A good example of how the church has capitulated to consumerism. I mean, think about the health and wealth gospel, right? That Jesus wants you to be rich and powerful and all these things. All you have to do is have faith. Add to that the way that technology has pretty much numbed our minds to anything beyond the dominant culture, which involves sensationalism, sound bites, all of those things. It's very, very addictive to many people. It's a soporific, I guess, is the word that is best used in that context. Um, how can we say that we experience these practices of memory, pain, and hope when we are, in many ways, part of the problem and not part of the solution? You know, there's not a whole lot of memory that involves, being an alternative subculture. There's not a lot of pain that is shared pain. There's certainly a lot of individual pain, right? But as a community of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, there's not. And without those things, it's very difficult to understand the theme of hope. Now, I'm not saying, and Brueggemann is not saying that these things are impossible, but what is necessary is for pastoral leadership to kind of peel away the blinders that blind us to uh, who we are as human beings, to think imaginatively about the way that we can experience the presence of God in those depths of our uh, unconscious that O'Connor was talking about. And it does require some imagination, some real imagination. And this is why I think it's so important, every day, every Sunday, I should say, that, before we start our worship service, Greg or Damon says, we want to affirm that the First Presbyterian Church is a community of hope, and you will always hear a message of hope preach from our pulpit. That's the beginning. That is the beginning, right? But hope can also be accentuated by the experience of pain that other human beings are experiencing around us. That identification with those who are suffering, and placing it in the context of narratives of suffering and narratives of alternative community that we find in Scripture. This is the real tragedy of what happens when people just read Scripture verse by verse, right? I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 2. That's one of my favorite verses. Or I'm going to, you know what Paul says in Galatians 1:47, putting that into a narrative instead of just a little soundbite is so important, because the whole story from Genesis all the way to Revelation is a follows a trajectory of hope. The whole story follows a trajectory of hope in the midst of suffering. And so this is, to speak personally, this is my, I feel like this is my calling. I'm not a preacher. Greg and I were just talking about this. Hey, Dan, you want to preach for me on some Sundays? And I said, absolutely not. It's just not my calling. Uh, but allow me to teach, and to talk about, where these scripture passages come from and what the historical, social, cultural context, what those things were when they were written. That really turns me on. So, pastoral leadership, and it's not just me or Greg, but it's all of us. We all have this calling, according to Brueggemann, to be vessels carrying this alternative vision, this alternative prophetic imagination. And I'm trying to remember this idea of imagination, the contrast. I'm trying to think of a good way to transition to this, but Brueggemann wants to make it clear that when we talk about the prophetic imagination, it's not like there's the dominant culture has insights into reality, and then we are trying to imagine a different reality. The thing that's probably most important for us to realize is that both of these sides of the equation are working in imagination. They are creating a narrative. It's that the imagination of the dominant culture isn't always necessarily influenced or inspired by the very things that we were just talking about, this hope and suffering that has taken place. The imagination of the dominant culture is usually one that's manipulated in order to establish, that dichotomy between the haves and have-nots, if you will. And that we do our best in the church when we try to come up with a different communal imagination for the church. But the more that we are co-opted into the dominant culture that says men should be, the ones preaching in church, and women, should just stay quiet, or that it says any number of those things that are power related, right? The more we're co-opted into that, the more our imagination is atrophied. It just goes away. And so the prophetic imagination is really trying to light a fire under people to see things in a different way. And it is, according to Brueggemann, what God has been doing all along. And according to, if you look at Paul's letter to the Corinthians, when he says, basically, our imagination, our prophetic imagination, is going to make us look like a bunch of fools, because we're tilting at windmills, according to the dominant culture. But what we are really doing is trying to follow God's call, God's foolishness, right? This is from Paul. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many were noble, of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are. That's a beautiful passage, one that, that gives us pause to reflect a little bit just on how alternative this reality really is. So that's where we are at the end of the preface. Are there any comments you'd like to make before we move on? Okay, then
Dan,
I'd like to, go ahead, Denny. Yeah.
Uh,
please.
just a cautionary thing I think that I'm trying to keep an eye on is Brueggemann, for me, seems to work best at the margins of contemporary society. And matter of fact, maybe all of society historically. Um, and I do wish, maybe this will change as we get further into his book, but I do wish that he had more awareness of social science research in the fields of anthropology and sociology of the last 50 years,
Mhm.
of where children all over the world acquire their values and at what age. And it's almost like, we have made some kind of intentional, conscientious decision, to ignore Brueggemann's message when we have been raised in the cocoon of our families, extended and otherwise, from age 1 or 2 to 5 or 6, I think most psychologists would say, is where we, absorb deeply the values that are going to shape our lives
Right.
and the values. And so I think Brueggemann is very good at pointing out, the limitations of that. But
Right.
I don't see very many examples, contemporary or otherwise, where maybe the Nordic countries might, on a good day, come closer than any other places in the world.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I, I, I can't agree with you more on this. Remember Brueggemann was writing 50 years ago when a lot of this, well, research was just coming about, I guess. But right now, one of the great benefits of me going to Central Community College, apart from the fact that I didn't get to teach and I never got to work with students or anything, is I really came to understand how important early childhood development is. And it's exactly what you're saying, Denny. Um, and when we think about, I'm going to use a conservative, nugget here, the breakdown of the family, when, we have two parents working, for the most part, and then our children are being raised in daycares and things like that, we don't really put enough emphasis on what's going on in those daycares. I mean, how likely is it that um, they're going to absorb any values other than the dominant social values that kind of rule our society, right? Now you mentioned the Nordic countries, but another place that does this quite well is Japan. In Japan, kids are not, I can't tell you how much respect I have for the Japanese early education. But kids are not graded until about the age of 10. They're basically, kind of taught social values of compassion and, working together and, modeling responsibility and things like that. And then the grades come later. The Nordic countries the same. They have the best early childhood education, but if you don't get them before 5 o'clock or before 5 o'clock, before 5 years old, you're absolutely right, Denny. I mean, that's when everything is set. That's when the brain is developing the most. I think, the growth of the brain happens, 80% of it happens in the, first couple of years of a child's uh, life. Uh, so, and to be quite honest with you, I don't know much research going on in the church that talks about this very issue, right? What are we doing in terms of early childhood education, in terms of, you know, uh, church education, Christian education? One of the great benefits that we have of having somebody like Rose Kep as our uh, I'll get her title wrong, but our Christian educator, our childhood Christian educator, is that um, she has been trained as a elementary school teacher. And I don't know if you've noticed, but when she starts doing when she does her children's sermons, she incorporates all of those things that are so important for kids to learn. A lot of, kinesthetic things like this, and teaching them how to pray, and that stuff is so essential. But I don't, you raise a great question, Denny, and I feel like pontificating on this for quite some time, and I will not do that. But you're absolutely right. The social scientific research is telling us that is, that's the make or break point, between birth and 4 or 5 years old. And guess what? You know how much money goes into early childhood education in our country? Almost zero. Almost zero. It doesn't take anybody to be an early childhood educator. You open up a daycare in your house, charge whatever it is. Well, we do have people who are educated in that area, but it's not a requirement. And imagine what that looks like in the church as well. So thanks for giving me something to think about for the rest of the day, Denny. Um, any other comments about that? I mean, we've just kind of gone down a rabbit hole here.
Not really.
Say that again.
Not really.
Oh, not really.
I
Yeah.
mean, this
Yeah.
this is something I think context is, as John Dominic Crossan, and others have pointed out, is so important to
Yeah.
to use as a mirror against, his ideas, which are in the abstract really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, as we move into chapter 1, you will see that this idea of alternative community is really plays a significant role. And he, as you probably have read already, he is going to center that community in the experience of the people of Egypt. The Hebrew people in Egypt, drawn out of their bondage into consider the ironic context here, drawn into an experience of freedom in the desert. Nothing available to them, utter vulnerability, utter dependence upon God. But nevertheless, it's a community of hope in the midst of its suffering. And so I wanted to try to introduce this chapter with really the thematic, with a thesis that he's going to be arguing here. It's the task of prophetic ministry. When we say prophetic ministry, we're just not talking about Greg and Damon. We're talking about us, right? We are all, what's great about if you look at our bulletin, it would say the ministers of the church. The pastor is Greg, the associate pastor is Damon. The ministers are the people of the body of Christ. So we should be engaged in prophetic ministry as well. It's the task of that ministry to bring the claims of the tradition and the situation of enculturation into an effective interface. We've been enculturated by the dominant culture, yet our tradition stands over against that in many ways. That is, the prophet is called to be a child of the tradition, one who has taken it seriously in the shaping of his or own field of perception and system of language. I like this idea of system of language. There is a kind of a language and certainly a perspective that comes through immersing ourselves in the narrative of theology, of the Christian theology. For example, this Advent, in terms of enculturation, we're usually enculturated to believe that the new year begins on January 1st, right? And that is just an old Roman idea that the church has adopted. But something that Damon does, and something that I've always tried to promote as well, is on the first Sunday of Advent, what does Damon say? You remember? Happy New Year. The tradition says that our year begins in hope. And so this Advent, I just want to encourage you to try to, take on that paradigm. I'm working, I'm gauging my time based upon the liturgical tradition. Advent, and then Christmas, and then Epiphany, uh, and the whole liturgical year. It's just one simple way to start to think differently about, your identity and the narrative that you claim as your own. Called to be a child of the tradition, one who has taken it seriously in the shaping of his or her field of perception and system of language. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and a perception alternative to the consciousness and the perception of the dominant culture around us. And that we just don't nurture and nourish that ex nihilo, out of nothing. We reach deep into the narrative of our tradition and interpret it for those around us. So I think I'll just say something very briefly here because our time's almost upon us. But Brueggemann does give us a very brief introduction into the role of the prophet. And he says there are some misconceptions as to what a prophet is. And what he says about liberals and conservatives was certainly true in the 1980s when people were reading this book. But the one misconception he wants to dispel is that a prophet was merely a fortune teller, a person who was going to, divine what the future had in store. And I think many people have this misconception that the prophets are the ones that are telling us what's going to happen, that God is going to destroy this, and then, and especially as we move into Advent, that, a king is going to arise, and it's referring to Jesus and all these things. We minimize the dynamics of the prophet when we just simply look at them as fortune tellers, right? And what Brueggemann says is that at the time when he was writing, this is one thing that conservatives did well. You might remember that, it was around 1988 that a book by the name by a man named Hal Lindsey came out, where he was reading the Hebrew prophets and all of the prognostications and the predictions about when God was going to return, because it was going to be a generation after the founding of the state of Israel and all this. That's turning the prophets into fortune tellers, right? People who are reading the tea leaves, basically. The conservatives at the time, and when Brueggemann was writing, were very good at that. The prophets are predicting the coming of Jesus. On the other hand, there is a misconception that the prophets are just these people, that are critiquing, the dominant culture and calling for social action. And that is something, according to Brueggemann, that in the 70s and the 80s, and certainly this was my experience, especially in the midst of the Iran-Contra affair and, our presence in Central and South America, that social action was what the prophets were all about, raising up the poor and, preaching justice and compassion and all of those things. And what Brueggemann says, and this is key for what he's trying to argue, is that the conservatives and the liberals both get it wrong. They take one half of the bagel and they disregard the other half, right? But eat the whole bagel, take the whole bagel and create an alternative consciousness. And that is, prophets must do two things. They must criticize the way the liberals say, uphold justice, uphold righteousness, but then they must also energize. They must create a consciousness of hope. Doing one apart from the other is to undermine the whole prophetic paradigm, right? Point out what is wrong. And we know this as well, right? We don't like those people who just like to criticize, but then never offer an alternative to that. We see a lot of that in our culture. But criticize and energize. point out what's wrong, but then create a place where people, a narrative of hope in which people can place themselves. Denny, did you want to say something? I thought I saw you.
Just, I'd go back to John Lewis so many times, when you pray, move your feet,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. Yeah. So it's evoking this alternative consciousness is really what the prophets want to do. And I'll just conclude by just a comment on page 4, maybe about 12 lines down. This is the practice of ministry that we should all be involved in, not just the pastors, right? This is a practice of ministry for which there is little readiness, indeed, not even among its would-be practitioners. So my programmatic urging, Brueggemann says, is that every act of a minister who would be prophetic is part of a way of evoking, forming, and reforming an alternative community. And I keep bringing up the First Presbyterian, but I really feel that in the last several years we have been trying to do that at First Presbyterian, but establishing the foundation on why we're trying to do that is also very important, which I hope we will do in reading this book. So when we return, I will mention to you why I brought up Oscar Romero here, but he was certainly a person in the 80s that or the late 70s and the 80s was living up in a prophetic way, I believe. So are there any comments before we're on our way?
Just finally, Dan, very briefly,
Yeah,
I'll give a plug to what we were talking about earlier, Flannery O'Connor. And her book, Wise Blood,
wise
is
blood.
right what he's talking about. It's what he's talking about. And so I'd urge everybody to read it. And there's a movie, I don't know where you'd find it, from 1979 that is almost a transcript of the book. And
Oh, really?
it's fantastic. But what my favorite line I gotta say before we leave is when you're talking about Hazel Motes and the Church of Jesus Without Christ.
Yeah.
And his basic tenet that he announces to everybody, it's where the lame don't walk and the dead stay that way.
That's exactly right.
And she's
Yeah.
got a great wit, and I just can't recommend it any higher.
That could come right out of Ezekiel, right? Oh, fantastic. Well, great. I'm glad all of you are aware of Flannery O'Connor. As I've said, I find her difficult to read. I guess I can't wrap my head around what she's doing. I really can't. But I can wrap my head around what Brueggemann says we should be doing here. I just need to draw that bridge between the two. So, well, thank you so much for that, Mac, because I'm going to look up that movie. Any other comments before we go? Well, if not, then thank you. It's always fun. I'm about 1 minute over our time, so we better not linger much longer. I will see you when I see you, I guess. If not Sunday, then some other time. Thanks, sir, everyone. And we're in chapter 1, and we'll probably stay there for next time as well. Okay. Thank you all. See you later.